Book 11th, Chapter 4 of The Ambassadors by Henry James. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. What he saw was exactly the right thing. A boat advancing around the bend and containing a man who held the paddles, and a lady at the stern with a pink parasol. It was suddenly as if these figures, or something like them, had been wanted in the picture, had been wanted more or less all day, and had now drifted into sight, with a slow current, on purpose to fill up the measure. They came slowly, floating down, evidently directed to the landing place near their spectator, and presenting themselves to him not less clearly as the two persons for whom his hostess was already preparing a meal. For two very happy persons he found himself straightway taking them, a young man in shirt-sleeves, a young woman easy and fair, who had pulled pleasantly up from some other place, and being acquainted with the neighbourhood, had known what this particular retreat could offer them. The air quite thickened at their approach with further intimations, the intimation that they were expert, familiar, frequent, that this wouldn't at all events be the first time. They knew how to do it, he vaguely felt, and it made them but the more idyllic, though at the very moment of the impression, as happened, their boat seemed to have begun to drift wide, the oarsman letting it go. It had by this time none the less come much nearer, near enough for Strether to dream the lady in the stern had for some reason taken account of his being there to watch them. She had remarked on it sharply, yet her companion hadn't turned round. It was in fact almost as if our friend had felt her bid him keep still. She had taken in something, as a result of which their course had wavered, and it continued to waver while they just stood off. This little effect was sudden and rapid, so rapid that Strether's sense of it was separate only for an instant from a sharp start of his own. He too had within the minute taken in something, taken in that he knew the lady whose parasol, shifting as if to hide her face, made so fine a pink point in the shining scene. It was too prodigious, a chance in a million, but if he knew the lady, the gentleman who still presented his back and kept off, the gentleman, the coatless hero of the idyll, who had responded to her start, was, to match the marvel, none other than Chad. Chad and Madame de Vionnet were then, like himself, taking a day in the country, though it was as queer as fiction, as farce, that their country could happen to be exactly his. And she had been the first at recognition, the first to feel, across the water, the shock, for it appeared to come to that, of their wonderful accident. Strether became aware, with this, of what was taking place, that her recognition had been even stranger for the pair in the boat, that her immediate impulse had been to control it, and that she was quickly and intensely debating with Chad the risk of betrayal. He saw they would show nothing if they could feel sure he hadn't made them out, so that he had before him for a few seconds his own hesitation. It was a sharp fantastic crisis that had popped up as if in a dream, and it had only to last the few seconds to make him feel it as quite horrible. They were thus on either side, trying the other side, and all for some reason that broke the stillness like some unprovoked harsh note. It seemed to him again, within the limit, that he had but one thing to do, to settle their common question by some sign of surprise and joy. He hereupon gave large play to these things, agitating his hat and his stick and loudly calling out, a demonstration that brought him relief as soon as he had seen it answered. The boat, in mid-stream, still went a little wild, which seemed natural, however, while Chad turned round, half springing up, and his good friend, after blankness and wonder, began gaily to wave her parasol. Chad dropped afresh to his paddles, and the boat headed round, amazement and pleasantry filling the air meanwhile, and relief, as Strether continued to fancy, superseding mere violence. Our friend went down to the water under this odd impression as of violence averted, the violence of their having cut him, out there in the eye of nature, on the assumption that he wouldn't know it. He awaited them with a face from which he was conscious of not being able quite to banish the idea that they would have gone on, not seeing and not knowing, missing their dinner and disappointing their hostess, had he himself taken a line to match. That at least was what darkened his vision for the moment. Afterwards, after they had bumped at the landing place and he had assisted their getting ashore, everything found itself sponged over by the mere miracle of the encounter. They could so much better at last, on either side, treat it as a wild extravagance of hazard, that the situation was made elastic by the amount of explanation called into play. Why indeed, apart from oddity, the situation should have been really stiff was a question naturally not practical at the moment, and in fact, so far as we are concerned, a question tackled, later on and in private, only by Strether himself. He was to reflect later on and in private that it was mainly he who had explained, as he had moreover comparatively little difficulty in doing. He was to have at all events meanwhile the worrying thought of their perhaps secretly suspecting him of having plotted this coincidence, taking such pains as might be to give it the semblance of an accident. That possibility, as their imputation, didn't of course bear looking into for an instant, yet the whole incident was so manifestly, arrange it as they would, an awkward one, that he could scarce keep disclaimers in respect to his own presence from rising to his lips. Disclaimers of intention would have been as tactless as his presence was practically gross, and the narrowest escape they either of them had was his lucky escape in the event from making any. Nothing of the sort, so far as surface and sound were involved, was even in question. Surface and sound all made for their common ridiculous good fortune, for the general invraisemblance of the occasion, for the charming chance that they had, the others, in passing, ordered some food to be ready, the charming chance that he had himself not eaten, the charming chance even more that their little plans, their hours, their train in short from là-bas would all match for their return together to Paris. The chance that was most charming of all, the chance that drew from Madame de Vionnet her clearest, gayest "Comme cela se trouve," was the announcement made to Strether after they were seated at table, the word given him by their hostess in respect to his carriage for the station, on which he might now count. It settled the matter for his friends as well. The conveyance, it was all too lucky, would serve for them, and nothing was more delightful than his being in a position to make the train so definite. It might have been, for themselves, to hear Madame de Vionnet, almost unnaturally vague, a detail left to be fixed; though Strether indeed was afterwards to remember that Chad had promptly enough intervened to forestall this appearance, laughing at his companion's flightiness and making the point that he had after all, in spite of the bedazzlement of a day out with her, known what he was about. Strether was to remember afterwards further that this had had for him the effect of forming Chad's almost sole intervention, and indeed he was to remember further still, in subsequent meditation, many things that, as it were, fitted together. Another of them was for instance that the wonderful woman's overflow of surprise and amusement was wholly into French, which she struck him as speaking with an unprecedented command of idiomatic turns, but in which she got, as he might have said, somewhat away from him, taking all at once little brilliant jumps that he could but lamely match. The question of his own French had never come up for them. It was the one thing she wouldn't have permitted. It belonged, for a person who had been through much, to mere boredom. But the present result was odd, fairly veiling her identity, shifting her back into a mere voluble class or race to the intense audibility of which he was by this time inured. When she spoke the charming, slightly strange English he best knew her by, he seemed to feel her as a creature, among all the millions, with a language quite to herself, the real monopoly of a special shade of speech, beautifully easy for her, yet of a colour and a cadence that were both inimitable and matters of accident. She came back to these things after they had shaken down in the inn parlour and knew, as it were, what was to become of them. It was inevitable that loud ejaculation over the prodigy of their convergence should at last wear itself out. Then it was that his impression took fuller form, the impression, destined only to deepen, to complete itself, that they had something to put a face upon, to carry off and make the best of it, and that it was she who, admirably on the whole, was doing this. It was familiar to him, of course, that they had something to put a face upon. Their friendship, their connection, took any amount of explaining, that it would have been made familiar by his 20 minutes with Mrs. Pocock if it hadn't already been so. Yet his theory, as we know, had bountifully been that the facts were specifically none of his business, and were, over and above, so far as one had to do with them, intrinsically beautiful; and this might have prepared him for anything, as well as rendered him proof against mystification. When he reached home that night, however, he knew he had been, at bottom, neither prepared nor proof; and since we have spoken of what he was, after his return, to recall and interpret, it may as well immediately be said that his real experience of these few hours put on, in that belated vision, for he scarce went to bed till morning, the aspect that is most to our purpose. He then knew more or less how he had been affected; he but half knew at the time. There had been plenty to affect him even after, as has been said, they had shaken down, for his consciousness, though muffled, had its sharpest moments during this passage, a marked drop into innocent friendly Bohemia. Then they had put their elbows on the table, deploring the premature end of their 2 or 3 dishes, which they had tried to make up with another bottle, while Chad joked a little spasmodically, perhaps even a little irrelevantly, with his hostess. What it all came to had been that fiction and fable were, inevitably, in the air, and not as a simple term of comparison, but as a result of things said; also that they were blinking it, all round, and that they yet needn't, so much as that, have blinked it; though indeed if they hadn't Strether didn't quite see what else they could have done. Strether didn't quite see that, even at an hour or two past midnight, even when he had, at his hotel, for a long time, without a light and without undressing, sat back on his bedroom sofa and stared straight before him. He was, at that point of vantage, in full possession, to make of it all what he could. He kept making of it that there had been simply a lie in the charming affair, a lie on which one could now, detached and deliberate, perfectly put one's finger. It was with the lie that they had eaten and drunk and talked and laughed, that they had waited for their carriole rather impatiently, and had then got into the vehicle and, sensibly subsiding, driven their 3 or 4 miles through the darkening summer night. The eating and drinking, which had been a resource, had had the effect of having served its turn; the talk and laughter had done as much; and it was during their somewhat tedious progress to the station, during the waits there, the further delays, their submission to fatigue, their silences in the dim compartment of the much stopping train, that he prepared himself for reflections to come. It had been a performance, Madame de Vionnet's manner, and though it had to that degree faltered toward the end, as through her ceasing to believe in it, as if she had asked herself, or Chad had found a moment surreptitiously to ask her what after all was the use, a performance it had none the less quite handsomely remained, with the final fact about it that it was on the whole easier to keep up than to abandon. From the point of view of presence of mind it had been very wonderful indeed, wonderful for readiness, for beautiful assurance, for the way her decision was taken on the spot, without time to confer with Chad, without time for anything. Their only conference could have been the brief instance in the boat before they confessed to recognising the spectator on the bank, for they hadn't been alone together a moment since and must have communicated all in silence. It was a part of the deep impression for Strether, and not the least of the deep interest, that they could so communicate, that Chad in particular could let her know he left it to her. He habitually left things to others, as Strether was so well aware, and it in fact came over our friend in these meditations that there had been as yet no such vivid illustration of his famous knowing how to live. It was as if he had humoured her to the extent of letting her lie without correction, almost as if, really, he would be coming round in the morning to set the matter, as between Strether and himself, right. Of course he couldn't quite come; it was a case in which a man was obliged to accept the woman's version even when fantastic. If she had, with more flurry than she cared to show, elected, as the phrase was, to represent that they had left Paris that morning and with no design but of getting back within the day, if she had so sized up, in the Woollett phrase, their necessity, she knew best her own measure. There were things, all the same, it was impossible to blink, and which made this measure an odd one. The too evident fact, for instance, that she hadn't started out for the day dressed and hatted and shod, and even, for that matter, pink parasoled, as she had been in the boat. From what did the drop in her assurance proceed as the tension increased? From what did this slightly baffled ingenuity spring, but from her consciousness of not presenting, as the night closed in, with not so much as a shawl to wrap around, an appearance that matched her story? She admitted that she was cold, but only to blame her imprudence, which Chad suffered her to give such an account of as she might. Her shawl and Chad's overcoat and her other garments, and his, those they had each worn the day before, were at the place, best known to themselves, a quiet retreat enough, no doubt, at which they had been spending the 24 hours, to which they had fully meant to return that evening, from which they had so remarkably swum into Strether's ken, and the tacit repudiation of which had been thus the essence of her comedy. Strether saw how she had perceived in a flash that they couldn't quite look to going back there under his nose, though honestly, as he gouged deeper into the matter, he was somewhat surprised, as Chad likewise had perhaps been, at the uprising of this scruple. He seemed even to divine that she had entertained it rather for Chad than for herself, and that, as the young man had lacked the chance to enlighten her, she had had to go on with it, he meanwhile mistaking her motive. He was rather glad, none the less, that they had in point of fact not parted at the Cheval Blanc, that he hadn't been reduced to giving them his blessing for an idyllic retreat down the river. He had had in the actual case to make believe more than he liked, but this was nothing, it struck him, to what the other event would have required. Could he, literally, quite have faced the other event? Would he have been capable of making the best of it with them? This was what he was trying to do now, but with the advantage of his being able to give more time to it, a good deal counteracted by his sense of what, over and above the central fact itself, he had to swallow. It was the quantity of make-believe involved, and so vividly exemplified, that most disagreed with his spiritual stomach. He moved, however, from the consideration of that quantity, to say nothing of the consciousness of that organ, back to the other feature of the show, the deep, deep truth of the intimacy revealed. That was what, in his vain vigil, he oftenest reverted to. Intimacy, at such a point, was like that. And what in the world else would one have wished it to be like? It was all very well for him to feel the pity of its being so much like lying. He almost blushed in the dark for the way he had dressed the possibility in vagueness, as a little girl might have dressed her doll. He had made them, and by no fault of their own, momentarily pull it for him, the possibility, out of this vagueness. And must he not therefore take it now as they had had simply, with whatever thin attenuations, to give it to him? The very question, it may be added, made him feel lonely and cold. There was the element of the awkward all round, but Chad and Madame de Vionnet had at least the comfort that they could talk it over together. With whom could he talk of such things? Unless indeed always, at almost any stage, with Maria. He foresaw that Miss Gostrey would come again into requisition on the morrow, though it wasn't to be denied that he was already a little afraid of her. What on earth, that's what I want to know now, had you then supposed? He recognised at last that he had really been trying all along to suppose nothing. Verily, verily, his labour had been lost. He found himself supposing innumerable and wonderful things. End of Book 11th, Chapter 4.